Chapter 5 of Stalkers and Strange Blondes. Garrett drew in a shaky breath and forced himself to focus. Any strange behavior could alert Aloysius, and Garrett had quite enough of Aloysius's questions for a while. Thank you very much. He glanced quickly at his friend over the book of mission reports he was reading. Aloysius was sucking on the end of his quill, completely absorbed in the essay he was writing, oblivious to the other keepers in the library. Lucky little Taffer, he thought. Garrett tried to continue reading, but he just couldn't. Not with them hanging around. There were 2 enforcers in the library. One of them he could see, wandering in and out of the rows of shelves, as though looking for a book. The other was nowhere to be seen. They had done nothing to bother Garrett. They hadn't even looked at him. But just knowing that they were close by was enough to grate on his nerves. Either I'm just getting paranoid, Garrett thought ruefully, or these creeps are following me. It was as though they were everywhere. True, the enforcers had free run of the compound, but Garrett had never been as aware of them before the whole incident with the shaman. Garrett forced the thought out of his head. Just thinking about that night made his insides go cold. He just wanted to forget about the whole thing, but that was bloody impossible with those stupid enforcers around, not to mention those stupid mission reports. It defied reasonable thinking that anything so exciting as a Keeper mission or Kareth Din could be so mind-bogglingly boring on paper. Dry, methodical descriptions of terrain and navigation through the underground city took up pages. More than once, Garrett found himself reading the same paragraph over and over again without realizing it. Hell, even the handwritten script was boring. The meticulous copperplate ink strokes laughed at Garrett, the spidery lines forming words and sentences that made perfect sense, yet were unintelligible in their snobby, monotonous language. Oh, get over it. You could be dealing with something a lot worse for what you did, Taffer, said Garrett's voice of reason. He hated that voice, but trudged on through the literary quagmire anyway. This sucks, he grumbled, reverting back to the slang of his youth. Really? Said Aloysius without looking up from his essay. I'd say it inhales vigorously myself. Shut up. Aloysius smirked. Come off it. It's really not as bad as you think it is. Oh, really? Garrett asked, raising his eyebrows. Aloysius grabbed the book with a snort, took one look at the page, and grimaced. Never mind, you win. When will you learn that I'm always right? Garrett sighed, feigning exasperation. Whatever, you have my condolences. Aloysius leaned over to glance at the page Garrett was reading. I'm not even sure if cetaceous is even a real word. How many more of these do you have to do after this one? Just 3 more, Garrett sighed. Damn, Aloysius breathed. You've done 3 already. I can't believe Keeper Master Artemis is making you do these just because you gassed a vendor. I mean, it was an accident, right? It was more of a statement than a question. Yeah. Garrett turned his eyes back to his book in favor of meeting Aloysius's eyes. His friend made a consoling noise and went back to his essay. Garrett made one last valiant stab at finishing the mission report before snapping the book shut. He needed a break, if only for 5 minutes. He stretched and leaned his chair back, making a loud creak that earned him a disapproving look from the librarian on duty. Hazy golden sunlight streamed in through the high circular windows of the library. Motes of dust glittered in the radiance, and the occasional fly zipped through like a shooting star. Hot, heady summer was coming to a close, but its death throes left the large space feeling warm and comfortable. Garrett leaned his cheek on his hand and closed his eyes for a moment, relishing the peace. The relative chaos of his early life had given him a healthy appreciation for quiet and solitude, even if the solitude existed only behind his closed eyelids.
There's no proof, Third.
What proof? How do you The voice rang through Garrett's mind like an iron bell, forcing him from his reverie. As much as he hated it, he knew that voice. It was the voice of an enforcer. Being as discreet as he could, Garrett turned his head this way and that, until he got sight of one of the enforcers. The one that had been perusing the shelves was still there, about 30 feet to Garrett's left, idly flipping through a large tome. Intuitively, Garrett knew the voice hadn't come from that one. The second enforcer was still out of sight, but Garrett knew it was still nearby. He and Aloysius were seated at a table close to the large arched entryway of the library, and neither of the enforcers could have left without Garrett's knowing. It must be at one of the upper levels, he thought. He slowly raised his eyes to the second and third floor balconies that overlooked the main floor of the library, but still saw no one. That's the one that must have spoken last. I don't know how I know. I just know. He listened again. He could have heard a pin drop by his accurate hearing, but there were no more voices. He pondered this for a moment. He had been in a semi-relaxed state when he had heard the first voice, and it seemed like he had heard only a small snippet of a conversation. Perhaps if he tried again. He slowed his breathing and closed his eyes again, listening for the utter quiet. For a moment, there was nothing but the usual sounds, until...
Believe it when I see it for myself. You're so stubborn, Ninth. I saw it. Fifth saw it. And Second saw it. You saw he discovered Seventh's body, and you knew that he knew of the mission beforehand. He might have just found Seventh by coincidence and finished the mission on his own prerogative.
That one there, by the bookshelves, is Ninth. Garrett opened his eyes slightly and allowed himself a quick peek at Ninth. Third is on the second level. The information he needed came seemingly from a stream of consciousness stretched between them. Ninth and Third like a silver thread. It was invisible, but Garrett could feel it out in his head. The sensation was so foreign. It scared Garrett a little. His head felt buzzy, like there was a hive of bees within his skull. It made him twitchy. He tried to focus harder, grasping the thread and giving it a mental tug.
What was that?
Ninth said, jerking about.
Did you feel it?
Panicking, Garrett opened his eyes and forced the thread away. Garrett? Garrett jumped and stared at Aloysius, who was standing over him and giving him a strange look. Garrett, what's the matter? You're all white. Nothing, Garrett answered quickly. I just, fell asleep for a second. Huh. Well, hurry up, or we're going to be late getting to the practice yard. Aloysius shouldered his satchel and motioned for Garrett to do the same. Garrett swung his bag over his shoulder and hurried after his friend, trying to ignore the way Ninth's mask seemed to follow him as he rushed out of the library. Concentrate, boy! I've never seen you with such a poor mind for sparring! Garrett winced as Keeper Master Duncan berated him. True, his mind wasn't so much on the wooden practice sword in his hand as it was checking to see if any enforcers were about. He couldn't find any so far, and the rational side of his mind kept telling him that it would be extremely unlikely to see any enforcer in the practice yard, seeing as they had a private courtyard away from the distractions of novices and acolytes running around. But still, the episode in the library had left him wary. His eyes flitted around the yard once more, still seeing no masked enforcers. Relieved for a moment, he faced his opponent, another novice named Ferris. Ferris was a mediocre swordsman, priding himself rather on his skill with a bowstaff. But so far, he had managed to beat Garrett twice. Keeper Duncan, who recognized talent when he saw it, was surprised and disappointed with Garrett's performance. "Well, get back in there and do it again," he growled at the dark-haired boy. Grimacing, Garrett stepped back into the sparring ring. The two boys circled each other, their swords raised. The smug look on Ferris's face turned Garrett's stomach so much he wanted to give him a good whack with the flat side of his weighted wooden sword, but held back. If Artemis had taught him anything, it was how to concentrate. Garrett grit his teeth and compelled his breathing to a slower pace. Ferris's defense on his left always had a hole. Garrett feigned a high left strike. Ferris raised his arm to block, and Garrett made a quick slash to his left side. Ferris saw the change in direction, however, and dodged the blow. He struck low, but Garrett quickly blocked and forced Ferris backwards, making him lose his bearings. Taking advantage of Ferris's lost balance, Garrett made a fast move and struck Ferris hard in the ribs with the flat of his blade. Ferris yelped and fell on his backside. Keeper Duncan clapped his hands twice, signaling the end of the match. The few novices resting at the edge of the cobbled ring applauded. The burly, older man offered a hand to Ferris and pulled him up. "Ferris, you take a breather. I'm gonna work with you on that half-assed defense of yours." Ferris walked off, grumbling and rubbing his ribs. "As for you, Garrett, that was a fine piece of work there, but you need to be able to pull that off every time and not get distracted like before. Got it? Good. You go over and work on your archery. I want to see some quality work over there." Garrett nodded quickly and jogged over to the weapons stand. He set his sword in its stand and selected a short bow and a quiver from the rack. He was fitting a string to the bow when Aloysius trudged over and offered him a water skin. Garrett took a swig and raised his eyebrows at his panting friend. "Duncan have you running laps or something?" he asked. "Yes," Aloysius admitted through his gasps. "I admit it. I'm no athlete. That's your job." "You only just noticed?" Garrett snorted, earning him a glare from the redhead. He put up his hands in a gesture of, "Just kidding," and gave Aloysius the water skin. He took a long drink and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. Garrett raised a brow. High-born, cultured Aloysius using his sleeve as a kerchief. He really must have been tired. Come on. Archery doesn't require running." Looking exceedingly relieved, Aloysius picked up a bow and strung it before following Garrett to a row of targets at the far end of the yard. They practiced in a companionable silence for a while. Garrett liked archery. It wasn't something he had to concentrate very hard on, but rather just let his hands and eyes do the work while his mind wandered. It was a warm day, so his thoughts drifted lazily away from the mess with the enforcers and rested on the balmy sunlight and the feel of the bowstring stretched taut under his fingers. "Hey, can I borrow an arrow?" said a voice that was definitely not Aloysius's. "Huh?" Garrett turned to his right to see a pair of cobalt eyes staring starkly into his gray ones. He startled a little and eyed the speaker. "An arrow? Can I borrow one?" she repeated. Sure," he said quickly, and handed her one from his quiver. She said a quick thank you and turned to her own target. Garrett pretended to fix the lacing of his wrist guard and studied her surreptitiously. She was a girl about his age, maybe a year or so older, with a pretty, impish face and white blonde hair. He recognized her from the meal hall, but, as a rule, boys and girls didn't mix much until they reached the acolyte rank when they turned 16. He wondered why she was here instead of with one of the girls' classes. He wanted to ask her name, but his voice caught and died a pitiful death in his throat as he made himself continue with his practicing. She fired her borrowed arrow, which hit a bit above center. A good shot, Garrett thought. She bit her lip disapprovingly and retrieved the arrow. She handed it back to Garrett with a nod and trotted over to the weapon rack. Garrett quickly realized he was gaping and quickly fired an arrow to make himself focus. His arrow struck one of the outer rings of the target. Garrett scowled at Aloysius's mocking laughter and went to gather up his arrows as Duncan bellowed for the students to clean up and head to lunch.